Welcome, dear students. Today, our topic for discussion is social movements in South Asia. First, let's understand social movements. Broadly speaking, social movement is an organized endeavor of a relatively large group of people to attain a particular outcome, typically social or political. According to the sociologist Mario Diani, a social movement consists of a process whereby several different actors, be they individuals, informal groups or organizations, come to elaborate either through joint action or communication a shared definition of themselves as being part of the same side of a social conflict. He further argues that nearly all the definitions of the concept of social movement that sociologists and political scientists have put forth share three criteria: a network of informal interactions between plurality of individuals, groups or organizations engaged in a political or cultural conflict on the basis of a shared collective identity. For the celebrated sociologist Charles Tilly defines social movements as concatenations of performative campaigns through which a group of people, usually ordinary people, put forth their collective claims upon others, usually the powerful elite. For Tilly, in the modern world, social movements have emerged as a major form of ordinary people's participation in public politics. He argues there are three major elements of a social movement. First, campaigns. A campaign is an organized and sustained effort making collective claims of target authorities. A repertoire of contention. It refers to the deployment of a combination of various forms of political action, public meetings, rallies, processions, vigils, demonstrations, petition drives, etc. for the attainment of the movement's political and social goals. WUNC displays. It means the participants' concerted public representation of worthiness, unity, numbers and commitments on part of themselves and their constituencies. Other researchers have also defined the concept of social movement in approximately similar vein. Sidney Toro defines a social movement as collective challenges to the elites, authorities or groups or cultural codes by people with common purposes and solidarity in sustained interactions with elites, opponents and authorities. Taro specifically underscores the distinction of social movements from political parties and interest groups. The sociologist John McCarthy and Mayer Zald also define social movement as a set of opinions and beliefs in a population which represents preferences for changing some elements of the social structure or reward distribution of the society. For Paul van Setters and Paul James, the emergence of a social movement entails the coming together of a few minimal conditions: the formation of some kind of collective identity, the development of a shared normative orientation, the common concern for the transformation of the status quo, and the occurrence of movements of concatenated practical action that are geared towards the aspired social or political transformation. They thus define a social movement as a form of political association between persons sharing at least a minimal sense of belonging with others to a common purpose and who come together across an extended period of time to effect social change in the name of that purpose. Now let us discuss about social movements in India. Thomas Bloom Hansen has noted, India offers us with the longest, most sustained and the most successful trajectory of democracy anywhere in the post-colonial world. Immediately after the national independence from the British in 1947, the major successor state of the Raj embarked on a bold experiment of electoral democracy that has remained stable for more than 7 decades now, with the exception of the emergency period between 1975 to 1977. In the 7 decades of its political independence, India's democracy has arguably been its greatest asset, the magic glue that has kept the dizzying array of linguistic, ethnic, and religious groups together as a unified nation. Moreover, Indian democracy is unique in the sense that poor exercise their right to vote more eagerly and in greater proportion than Indian middle classes and the elites. In India alone, the poor form not just an overwhelming majority of the electorate but vote in large numbers than the better off. Everywhere else, without exception, the ration of electoral participation is the reverse. However, despite its popularity among the masses and remarkable success in establishing functioning institutions, there remain critical questions to be asked of the Indian electoral democracy. The economists Jean Dires and Amartya Sen have formulated a penetrating critique of India's developmental trajectory. They have noted that in terms of the basic indicators of social development, for instance, female literacy rate, infant mortality rate, life expectancy, etc., India is falling behind its poorer South Asian neighbors. The fact of low social development becomes starker in the backdrop of impressive growth of the country's GDP over the last 2 decades. The mammoth growth rates have not translated into significant enhancement of the quality of the life of the majority of country's inhabitants. In short, over a long period of time in India, the rule by the people has coexisted with massive poverty among the masses and inequality between classes and communities. The persistence of poverty, inequality, social violence, along with caste, gender, and communal vectors in the Indian society has over the decades created fertile ground for the rise of various social movements, wherein people from different communities galvanized around the particular issues, and because the institutions of democracy were simultaneously being evolved in the country, there have often been conjunctures between democratic processes and the emergent social movements. In the following sections, we are going to discuss briefly some of the major social movements that took place in the post-independence India. Chipko movement. Chipko movement, also referred to as the Chipko Andolan, was a non-violent social and ecological movement by the rural people, especially women, aimed at protecting forests and trees slated for government-backed logging. The movement originated in the Himalayan region of Uttarakhand, then part of the state of Uttar Pradesh, in 1973 and quickly spread to the other Himalayan regions. The movement gets its name from the Hindi word chipko, which means to hug or to killing to. The word reflects the demonstrators' primary tactic of hugging the trees to impede the wood loggers. Chipko movement went on to become an inspiration for non-violent environmentalists throughout the world. It also created a successful precedent for initiating non-violent protest movements in India. Sundarlal Bahuguna, a Gandhian activist, gave the movement a proper direction, and its success meant that activists and political organizers throughout the world immediately took notice of the non-violent environmental movement. In time, the Chipko movement would go on to inspire many ecologically oriented social movements, seeking to stem the rapid environmental degradation wrought by predatory capitalism and raising awareness about the impending dangers of climate change for the humankind. Above all, however, it stirred up the Indian civil society to seriously address the issues of tribals and other marginalized people. Women played a prominent role in the movement and practiced the methods of satyagraha to resist the chopping of the forests. The Indian environmentalist Vandana Shiva has argued that Chipko Andolan was both an eco-socialist and an eco-feminist movement. As the movement matured, it did not remain confined to the specific demand of protecting a particular forest area. The larger issues of economic and ecological exploitation of the Himalayan regions became the focus of the Chipko movement. It was demanded that local communities should have effective control over the natural resources like land, water, and forests. The movement also took up the issues of landless forest workers and demanded guarantees of minimum wages for them. The movement succeeded at least in its immediate objectives when in 1980 the government banned the felling of trees in the Himalayan region for the 15 years until the green cover was fully restored. Narmada Bachao Andolan. It was a social movement spearheaded by the tribals, Adivasis, farmers, environmentalists, and human rights activists against a number of large dam projects across the Narmada River, which flows through the states of Gujarat, Madhya Pradesh, and Maharashtra. One of the biggest dams on the river was the Sardar Sarovar Dam in Gujarat. It became one of the first focal points of the movement. The dam was a part of the Narmada Dam project that was purportedly aimed at proving electricity and irrigation to the people of these states. People in the movement employed different tactics like legal action against the project, hunger strikes, rallies, and gathering of support from notable artists and filmmakers, etc. The Narmada Bachao Andolan, along with two of its leading spokespersons, Medha Patkar and Baba Amte, received the Right Livelihood Award in 1991. In 1985, the Sardar Sarovar Dam project was being investigated due to an order from the Ministry of Environment and Forests, Government of India, for non-fulfillment of basic environmental conditions and the lack of completion of crucial studies and plans. Further, the villagers whose lives and livelihoods were going to be affected by the project were also not given adequate information. In the same year, a young activist named Medha Patkar approached the Ministry of Environment to seek clarifications about the project, and it was revealed that the project was not sanctioned at all. It was further disclosed that the government officials had overlooked the problems likely to arise from the completion of the project. At the same time, it came to fore that the displaced people were compensated only for their immediate standing crop and not for displacement and rehabilitation. In order to resist the project, a 36-day-long solidarity march was organized from Madhya Pradesh to the site of the Sardar Sarovar Dam. The march was foiled by the police, who canned the marchers and arrested the activists. Medha Patkar also undertook a 22-day hunger strike that almost took her life to pressurize the government into scratching the project. As a result of the protest movement, the World Bank, the chief funding agency of the project, was forced to set up the MOS Commission, an independent review of the project. The report stated that the Narmada Dam project violated the World Bank's policy on environment and resettlement. As a result, in 1993, the World Bank pulled out of the project. Although the project was shelved for the period, the construction of the Sardar Sarovar Dam was restarted in 1999, and the dam was finished in 2006. It was inaugurated by the current Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi in 2017. Nevertheless, the social movement resulted in the court effecting an immediate halt of the construction work and directing the states to complete the rehabilitation and resettlement process of those people whose lives and livelihoods were affected by the project. The movement still continues to fight for the rehabilitation of the displaced people as well as the reception of the compensation promised by the Narmada Tribunal. Anti-corruption movement led by Anna Hazare in 2011. The Indian anti-corruption movement was a series of demonstrations and protests across India that began in 2011. The goal of the movement was the introduction of strong legislative and enforcement measures against the political corruption perceived to be deeply entrenched in the Indian political field. The movement gained momentum from 5 April 2011 when the anti-corruption activist Anna Hazare began a hunger strike at the Jantar Mantar monument in New Delhi. The movement sought to lessen the corruption in the Indian government through the introduction of the Jan Lokpal Bill. Another goal of the movement was to repatriation of the black money allegedly stashed away in the foreign banks. The mass protests focused on the profound problems plaguing the Indian democracy, including political corruption, kleptocracy, and other forms of corruption. The movement primarily adopted the tactics of non-violent civil resistance, like demonstrations, marches, acts of civil disobedience, hunger strike, and rallies, etc. The activists in the movement also deployed the new social media technologies for the purpose of organization of the protest events and for the communication with the wider public. In the years preceding the anti-corruption movement of 2011, the UPA-II government had become mired in the cases of alleged corruption. These included the Adarsh Housing Society scam, the 2010 housing loan scam, the radio tapes controversy, and the 2G spectrum case. It is against this backdrop that the social activist Anna Hazare demanded a joint committee composed of members of the government and of civil society be formed to draft a tougher anti-corruption legislation. After the then Prime Minister Manmohan Singh rejected Hazare's demand, Hazare began a hunger strike on 5th April 2011 at the Jantar Mantar, Delhi. Although the movement failed to press the Indian government to pass the Lokpal Bill 2011, it laid the ground for the emergence of a new political party, the Aam Aadmi Party, under the leadership of Arvind Kejriwal, that would go on to record a spectacular victory in the 2015 Delhi Assembly elections, sweeping 67 out of 70 seats. The aforementioned were some of the social movements that the post-independence India has witnessed. There have been other socio-political movements, some of them quite recent, that we have not covered in this discussion for the paucity of space. The most important among them are the anti-CAA movement spearheaded by the Indian Muslim women in Delhi's Shaheen Bagh and the farmers' protest of 2021. Now let us talk about social movements in Pakistan. Like India, Pakistan too has a long history of social movements. Unlike India, where social movements have sought to engage with the deepened existing and relatively well-established democratic institutions and practices, the Pakistani social movements have struggled primarily against the iron grip on the country's politics of the powerful military establishment. In this discussion, we are going to briefly mention 3 such social movements against military authoritarianism that took place in Pakistan: the 1960s students' movement, the movement for the restoration of democracy in 1980s, and the lawyers' movement in 2007. The students' movement of 1968. The students' movement was a protest movement against the military regime of General Ayub Khan. It took the form of mass uprising of students, later on joined by the industrial workers of the Pakistan's prominent urban centers. The movement began in early November 1968, and by the end of March 1969, according to the prominent historian and activist Tariq Ali, around 10 to 15 million people had been involved in the movement, directly or indirectly. The upshot of the movement was the end of Ayub regime towards the end of March 1969. The movement for restoration of democracy. It was a socio-political movement led by a coalition of left-wing political parties of Pakistan against the military regime of General Zia-ul Haq. The movement was led by the late Pakistani politician Benazir Bhutto, and its aim were the restoration of democracy in Pakistan as well as the establishment of civilian control over the country's powerful military. The movement was rooted mainly in the rural areas of Sindh province, the traditional stronghold of Pakistan People's Party. In 1977, General Zia had seized power by overthrowing the government of Prime Minister Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. A couple of years later, in 1979, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto was executed by the Supreme Court of Pakistan. Both the coup and execution were deeply unpopular in Pakistan, especially in Bhutto's stronghold of Sindh. Although it was one of the largest non-violent movements in South Asia since the time of Gandhi, it was faced with effective and vigorous repressive measures from the military regime. The movement fizzled out after General Zia-ul Haq's death in a plane crash in 1988 paved the way for relatively peaceful general elections. The lawyers' movement. It's also referred to as the movement for the restoration of judiciary or the Black Coat protests. It was a movement of mass protests initiated by the lawyers of Pakistan in response to Pervez Musharraf's decision to unconstitutionally suspend the Chief Justice of Pakistan, Iftikhar Chaudhry. Musharraf was a military ruler of Pakistan who had seized power in 1999 by deposing the democratically elected Prime Minister Mian Nawaz Sharif. Chaudhry's suspension was met with protests from Pakistan's legal community, with senior judges and lawyers initiating the Adliya Bachao Tehreek, Save the Judiciary movement, with the aim of getting the suspended Chief Justice reinstated and safeguarding the fragile independence of country's judiciary. The Adliya Bachao Tehreek is seen as the precursor of the much larger lawyers' movement. It must be kept in mind that the lawyers' movement was not confined to lawyers only. It was also joined by civil society organizations, activists, and opposition political parties, all of which saw the end of Musharraf's military rule. General elections were held in 2008 that resulted in the formation of a coalition government with Asif Ali Zardari as the President of Pakistan. After some initial reluctance, Zardari eventually reinstated the Chief Justice and dozens of other judges who had been ousted by the previous regime. These are only a few of the several social movements that have emerged in the history of the post-colonial state of Pakistan. More recently, the country has seen the rise of the reinvigorated women's movement that organizes the Aurat March every year on the International Women's Day. Every year, Aurat March is joined by tens of thousands of Pakistani women and men seeking to protest against and subvert the country's deeply patriarchal culture. Another notable social movement to emerge in Pakistan in the last few years is the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement that has agitated against the Pakistan Army's excesses against the country's tribal Pashtuns. Dear students, with this I conclude today's lecture. Hope you have understood it well. Thank you for watching it.